Hey loves, we're Maria and Nicole, two 30-something relationship and sex therapists, and this is Relationally Speaking. We're cutting through the small talk and getting unfiltered about love, dating, sex, and intimacy. We're here to make those uncomfortable conversations we've tiptoed around just a tiny bit more comfortable.
Hi, welcome back to Relationally Speaking with Nicole Ness, a certified sex therapist, and
Maria Sosa, licensed marriage and family therapist.
Welcome back to another episode of Relationally Speaking. If you didn't listen to last week's episode, go back to that because we talked about gas and brakes and how it relates not to cars, but sexual desire. Go back and listen, but if not, start here. We will not judge you. So let me explain a little bit about the gas and brakes and the sexual desire. Essentially, that is what turns us on, what shuts us down, and why this is such a huge and important topic or concept when we're trying to understand why we may or may not feel desire. But here's the thing. If you don't even know what you desire, then this whole brakes and gas and cars whole situation might make you freeze. And it might be a little premature. So let's roll back and start with your desire blueprint. And Nicole, who knows a little bit more about this than me, I am a couples therapist, not specifically a sex therapist, but Nicole, you are the sex guru of our little podcast. And so she teaches me all of these amazing little tidbits that I then go and share with my clients or refer out. And one of the things that she shared with me was that there's these three different types of, hold on, I'm going to F it up. There's three different types of arousal. There's three different types of desire. I'm going to let you take over. Yes.
It is. So actually, I'm so glad you said arousal because arousal and desire are two separate things.
Okay.
We totally conflate them and we interchange them. And they're not all that different, but the distinction I think is important to name, especially to our clients and with ourselves and with our partners, is arousal is the physiological experience that's happening in our body as a result of coming into contact with like sexually appealing, pleasurable, arousing sort of material, right? So that can look like lubrication, that can look like getting hard, you name it. Desire is mental. It's all in our head. It's when we start to think of something and start to feel an urge to possibly be intimate. And keep in mind, those two things can happen either together, like simultaneously. I can both feel desire and my body is responding to that desire. Or sometimes I can feel desire for something and nothing happens to my body. Or something could be happening to my body. I'm like responding to touch, but I actually don't want it. So that's why it's a really important distinction that those two things can happen simultaneously and often do, but there are many situations in which it's one or the other. So that was completely off tangent.
No, but so necessary because now I'm like, yeah, that makes so much sense. And now I'm kind of like putting these two concepts together. And obviously thinking about myself at times where I've been like, oh, yes, I'm in the headspace, but not physiologically.
Nothing's happening.
Nothing's happening, right? I love that, it's two different things. Yes, but go back and so that's the difference, but there's three different types of desire.
Desire, yes.
Okay.
So we'll break them down with the one that has the most kind of correlation with the gas and the brakes that we were talking about in last episode would probably fall into contextual desire or responsive desire. So keep in mind, right? Gas and brake pedals are essentially the things that we are looking for subconsciously, consciously in our environment that are either saying, yes, sex is a go there with yourself or your partner, or sex is off the table. So we're looking for contexts, right? So your environment matters with contextual desire, and people who feel desire contextually will look for things such as, is there privacy? Are the kids asleep? Are we connected today? Did we come out of a really emotionally connective conversation and now sex is something that is more accessible to me? So responsive looks a little bit different. Essentially, arousal will lead to desire. So what I mean by that is those of us who might experience responsive desire we might not necessarily be the person who's thinking about wanting sex, right? We might be watching TV with our partner, really just focus on the show we're watching, but then our partner might start to touch us in a way that actually feels really, really good. Not that unwanted pat,
Cat, right? Not the cat.
not the pat that we all hate,
Mhm.
but in a way that feels good. And then that arousal makes them think, oh, I wasn't in the mood for this, but this is feeling really good. And so I'm going to follow that pleasure. So touch usually is happening and they're open to the touch, right? They're receiving it and then it spurs desire. Spontaneous, the last one is your kind of what we all think we want sex to look like. And actually, that's what I hear couples coming to me the most with when they're coming with like an absent sex life or decreased sexual frequency is they're like, man, it just used to feel so spontaneous and natural. And like we would just rip up each other's clothes off and like be in the sex. So it's that like movie sex. It's happening. We both are there. We're both wanting it. And it's the desire usually before arousal. So it's already in my mind. I'm wanting the sex with you. I'm wanting the intimacy. And then we start having it. And I'm like, great, this feels good. So mental and emotional before physiological. And it's usually the one people, again, get really stuck in wanting because they describe it as passionate and fun and just, it should be happening this way if we desire each other.
It makes you feel wanted and it kind of taps into those human needs of I am wanted by my partner, and that can feel very good versus it's a bit of an afterthought, or I have to think about it, or I have to kind of be in the mood for it. So there's very much this preference for sex to look like this spontaneous thing because I think it makes us feel better about ourselves versus, oh, I
Yeah.
really have to think and plan because we have this concept that you should just want to have sex. You should just want me and you should want to be sexy with me. So it's very much this personalized uh, kind of layer to these three different types of desire and how we value one over the other, I'd say.
So interesting too, because I always share with clients too who are really stuck in the spontaneous, and I get why they want it, especially if they're not currently feeling it. But sex honestly is not all that spontaneous, even though it felt spontaneous and spur of the moment in the initial phases of your dating. You were likely planning for the sex you might have that night. You were picking the dinner spot that might have spurred intimate conversation. You might have shaved. You might have wore cute panties, not like your like old panties, right? And so like is it truly spontaneous or was there also an element of planning as well?
That is such a good assessment because, yes, to some extent, there is the planning, there is the anticipation. I think we're just more thoughtful about it then, right? Like in the beginning stages, you're much more
Yeah.
intentional, you're much more thoughtful. It's still all new as well. So you're kind of pulling out all the stops to make sure that this happens. And I think that when the relationship develops, we're less intentional about that. And it
Mm,
feel the same way. You're kind of just like, oh yeah, this is convenient. Like, yeah, sure, we'll go out to
yeah,
dinner and then we'll come back and make it a thing. So I think you're right. There's always been to some extent a bit of that planning. It's never really been 100% spontaneous, but the way that we planned it was very different at the beginning of the relationship than,
absolutely.
middle or, after a certain amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so interesting because, we've had this conversation before, and every time you tell me, I'm always just like, oh, this is so cool. Because I'd never really heard about these three different types of desire before, like at all. And I think that's the weirdest part because, again, we just expect this whole desire thing to be natural. You either have it or you don't. And the fact that there are actual labels for it or actual terminology for it, spontaneous, responsive, contextual, it feels almost a little counterintuitive. Like, why do we need words for something that's just supposed to be happening? Didn't we just do it and stop thinking about it so much? Like, stop talking, no talking, more doing, right? Like, stop talking about it. But the more that I sit with it, the more that I realize maybe that's actually the problem, that we've been taught that desire is this effortless, automatic thing. And when it doesn't show up that way, we assume that something is wrong. But, not to use some dumb analogy about going to the gym, but it always kind of works.
It does.
But it's like a muscle, and it's something that you can work on and strengthen and put in your reps and fine tune rather than, you eat a salad and you're just like, my abs are supposed to appear out of nowhere, right? Like I did the thing, I ate a salad, so we're done. And that's obviously similar kind of thing when it comes to the desire and it takes effort. It took effort at the beginning of the relationship. It's always taken some sort of effort. So stop thinking that it's this effortless thing to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people find some grief in that, especially if at one point in the relationship, and it tended to be early on, it did look effortless or it felt effortless. And so I think there is like some loss that a lot of people feel of, okay, now there is this thing where it's not just going to happen in the way that I thought it was just happening. I'm going to have to kind of tune into myself and get to know myself a little bit more and what it is that I want, and then what my partner wants, and then how can we create a dynamic where we're just having good sex with each other in the way that we define good sex. And I think that in itself, at least what I notice, is when that shows up in the therapy space, or when that's even showed up in my life, is to have the conversation around what is it that you want sexually, right? What do you want? What do you desire? What do you like? Is I hear often, I don't know. I don't know what I want. And it's fine, right? The sex we're having is fine. It's good, right? And my thought is, well, okay, well, what could make it, fantastic, right? Like what could make it feel really pleasurable for you? And again, it's a lot of that I don't know. And I think that's kind of where, before we even get to building out this desired blueprint, we've kind of first talk about those blocks, right? So we have probably a lot of listeners too who actually need that conversation before naming their gas and brakes, right? So to understand what we desire sexually, what this desire blueprint is, what it's made up of, we need to first understand what's blocking our desire. And so kind of thinking about different realms that shows up, the first one that comes to mind for me as a therapist is family of origin messaging, right?
It's all in our childhood. And this is all your parents' fault.
Yes, it's truly though, right? We witness this stuff at an early age and it gets embedded. And if we're not actively kind of working with it and kind of maybe challenging some of it, we're really going to behave according to those old scripts we were taught. And so I think about, the absence of talking about sex is just as harmful as explicitly talking very negatively or shamefully about it. But silence around sex actually teaches us that this shouldn't be talked about. Silence says this conversation around sex is bad, and therefore I would be bad if I talked about it or had it. It's that very hush hush mindset around sex that fills the home, that keeps us at a distance from our own sexuality and desire. Right? So, as a child, we're thinking, probably pretty subconsciously at this age, if the big people in my home, if my parents and my caregivers are shutting down this conversation or not even opening it up, then surely, finding what it is that I desire sexually isn't something I really need to be seeking out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big concept for a little person to think.
Yeah, that's a really big concept. Yeah, that's like a very developed little person.
Yeah, yeah. I think, it even starts as we don't talk about that, right? Like it's the basic things of like, this is good, this is bad. And so we kind of get stuck in these good and bad patterns, and it just becomes this either bad thing or just like silence thing, as you're saying.
Yeah.
I grew up in what I would say was a really sex positive home. I got a little sex talk and a book about where babies come from. I still remember it to this day, and I would log around my little book. But sex was just always framed as like sex is good, right? Like there is nothing wrong with sex. However, caveat, this is something that you do with someone that you love, right? There was always this layer of love attached to it, and I get that. Again, really important messaging when you're teaching a child, little baby. I mean, I don't think that they said that in those specific words, but very basic language. And that stuck with me, right? So that kind of became to some extent the messaging. that I took with me. And I remember being a teenager and sitting with my friends, and they were talking about hookups and first times. And I didn't have a framework for any of that because all I knew was this is about love and sex is wrapped around in that. There was no curiosity, there was no sense of pleasure. I was pretty much given just one single little puzzle piece to this whole picture. And because there wasn't an updated talk from my little child version of me, I just kept going back to that early model, believing that desire didn't really play a part in it. It was just love, and it was the thing that you did when you were in love. So desire wasn't really a part of any of the conversations related to sex whatsoever. Not until, oh my God, I don't even want to say it, but not really until my 30s. So yeah, it's a
Yep.
new thing. It's a new thing for me, but it
Yeah.
had a really big impact on me for sure.
Sex kind of attached to, yeah, you must love this person. I assume must be in a relationship then with this person, right?
Oh
I'm
yeah.
conflating maybe the two, but
Oh, no, you're actually, I mean,
yeah.
they could be separate, but in my case, it was definitely a thing that was. And it was a lot of vetting and a lot of making sure that this other person, and to be fair, looking back on it, it didn't turn out all that badly, like it was okay that I was being very thoughtful and very intentional.
Yeah.
I was sharing my body with, and it definitely lacked a piece about what it meant to me, whether I was enjoying myself. So, big picture, okay, makes sense. There just was very little emphasis on what it meant to me or how I fit into the picture.
It's so interesting because yes, it sounds like sex positive home, right? Like carrying around this book about babies. I imagine there was not a stork on the front holding the baby in its mouth.
No. However, they just spelled the stork story. So like it literally starts with
Yeah.
like how we think babies come from the stork. So that was like the beginning of the book of like that's not it. So again, my very educated family was like, we're gonna, share all of these
Mhm.
bits and pieces about sex with you. So yeah.
Let me ask, was it so you have sex with somebody you love. Was it also then kind of like, did something else come from that where it was to maintain the love, then I must have sex?
Ooh, I don't think it went that far. I mean, I think like that morphed later into something else where it was if you love me, then you will continue to want to have sex with me. Almost kind of like if you don't, then you don't love me
Yeah.
anymore. So
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Uh-huh. I get that. And my family too, super sex positive, I would say. My mom and I probably have two open of conversations that have made some past partners very uncomfortable with the level of which we share and talk. But we've just always been open. I remember my dad had picked me up from my high school boyfriend's house because I wasn't driving to his house for some reason. And I did have my license, but my dad had picked me up and it was the first time I had sex. And I remember just kind of crying. And I went home, and mom and me talked about it for hours. And we talked about what that meant and how I felt. And there was no you lost your virginity talk because that's just a whole messy concept in and of itself. But it was I just remember that opened up the door for me to always feel safe to share with mom and maybe not so much dad. He doesn't need to know everything, but with mom, right? She was a safe person to hear and, um, yeah, it was amazing. It shifted everything for me. That moment I remember so clearly. But back to blocks.
Yes,
Another huge one.
on our
Yeah,
tangent.
I know. It's so hard not to just go on these tangents because these are conversations Maria and I like to have outside of this podcast space. So a huge one though, sex, gender, the patriarchy. Right? No surprise here. I mainly wanted to speak to women learning their pleasure is deprioritized alongside her male partner. So, in a heterosexual relationship, we're talking about, but this gendered messaging around females' primary objective and goal for sex is to ensure their male partner is satisfied, which obviously automatically kind of decenters her own pleasure and what she wants. If I'm so focused on you and making sure you achieve this goal, how am I supposed to have space to learn about what I want? Right? Because they don't really matter as much as your wants. I see this constantly and in such subtle ways that some clients are not even able to name until we really start talking about what happens during sex. And there's this performance element, there's this anxiety attached to it. And it all comes back to I need to make sure that you are pleasured. And even if that is at the expense of my own. So that's a really, really big one for women, and men honestly have it pretty rough as well. So they are conditioned at a pretty young age that they are to perform well, which I mean essentially means have a hard penis, right? Like perform, get an erection, and don't you dare lose it, right? So it's this messaging that you are the one, the vehicle, you're providing the sex. And again, if you're so wrapped up in like, I have to perform and be on and maintain this erection. We are so in our head trying to manage that, that of course, again, we don't have space to think about what it is that we even want from the sex that we're having.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think that that was one of the things that we also talked about in the previous episode, this outcome based sex and outcome based sexuality. So that's very relatable to that.
Yeah. Yeah. We won't go into too many more. I think those were main ones, but think about religion can be a huge block. Again, it comes back to messaging that if your religion told you X, Y, and Z about sex, and if you have sex, then that means A, B, and C, right? A lot can get internalized, and we're not bashing religion. I truly think that religion can coexist and, live alongside a sexual relationship with yourself and your partner. Culture, past relationships, right? If you previously expressed what you wanted from sex and your partner kind of shut it down or didn't really express curiosity, we kind of learned that this isn't something we bring up. My desires aren't a conversation to be had. So just all these things might keep us from even knowing what it is that we want, right? So we first have to name those and make sense of those.
Yeah. And I think that the part there that's really a big opportunity here is this idea of unlearning and this opportunity to strip away the old scripts that we didn't even realize we were following and start fresh. So, what if we stopped assuming that desire should look a certain way and instead just got curious about what it could be, right? So, I think that's one of the things that is really hard for us to kind of conceptualize, which is I've always been this person or I've always done it this way without getting to that second piece, which is, well, what could it be? Like, what if we experimented? What if we questioned? What if we explored without this sense of judgment? And again, going back to this piece of maybe desire isn't something that just works, quote unquote. Maybe it's something that we create with ourselves, that we co-create with our partners. Um, and not waiting for that spark, because that's also like another big one, just waiting for the spark, but kind of tending to the flames ourselves. It doesn't just arrive. We're gonna have to work on that. And I think that there's something so empowering and liberating about that, that we get to decide what to do with that versus just waiting for either for it to happen, for our partners to take the lead, for things to just kind of unfold in the sequence. But okay, if I'm in charge and I have the ability or I have a role to play when it comes to this, what do I really want? What do I enjoy? What do I like? What feels good? That is such an empowering and kind of liberating place to be.
To even get to that space, we have to give ourselves permission to even feel desire. A lot of people who have trouble kind of even answering that question or saying, what is it that I want? Usually have so much trouble just slowing down. That is what I find over and over. And I don't know if you agree with that, but it's like so much of, let me backtrack. If we're to figure this out, I always say start outside of the bedroom first, right? Jumping straight to the bedroom, which we will talk about, can feel really pressure filled or overwhelming. And so start outside of the bedroom. What is that pastry you really enjoy getting at the coffee shop that you don't allow yourself to buy that often, but that you really enjoy? What is it about that pastry? How does it taste? What's the texture? What does it smell like? How does it feel on your tongue? Right? And I've done this before with a couple actually, where one of the partners really could not access what felt good sexually. It was, okay, orgasm. It was like, great. Okay, cool. That's where we're at, right? Orgasm feels great. What about it, right? And we kept hitting this block of language. We couldn't quite describe it. But when I asked them to describe a meal they recently enjoyed, she just went off. Her language, her adjectives, her descriptions. It was just so fun to hear her talk about this meal. It's like, okay, let's lean more into that, right? So where can we pick up little nuggets of pleasure in our lives on a more daily basis? So if you are walking to the gym, I personally walk to the gym every day and walk home, and I'm always in such a rush. I'm like, I got to get to the gym, I got to do my workout, and I come home, make breakfast. Great. What would happen if you slowed that down? And what if I took note of how it's really cold out here right now, actually, in the morning, but what if I like enjoyed how that felt on my skin? And what if I stopped to smell a flower, right? Like, I don't know if I'm actually going to do that. That one doesn't really feed into my blueprint. But the point of this is slowing down and just letting yourself kind of have permission to savor little moments. And I find that clients who are so blocked from their desire just aren't giving themselves access to that.
Yes. And as you were talking about this pastry at the bakery, I literally just imagined it and just had this whole little experience with a chocolate eclair. Like that's literally.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I thought about how often, going back to these blockages, we've been taught to feel guilty about these pleasures, right? Like, and now you've had the chocolate eclair, and now you should feel guilty about the fact that you've had this really delicious pastry. And I think that that's also some of the desire and the pleasure component, almost like there's a bit of guilt attached to it, just like that chocolate eclair that you are having. But I love how that connection, for your clients kind of help them tap into that. I would go and smell that flower. That is part of my
That's,
blueprint.
yes.
That is mine. When you said it, I was like, I do that. And it's what I genuinely do. So talking about the blueprint that you kind of, hinted at, and I'm kind of hinting at as well, we are talking about the erotic blueprints. And I first heard about the erotic blueprints from the Goop series on Netflix. It was on a couple of years back. And I know that Goop gets a bad rep every now and then with a little bit of their kind of extreme things that they push. But this was actually really interesting and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was engaging and it was fun and I loved how they broke it down. So the erotic blueprints were developed by, get her name wrong, Jaya Ma. She is a somatic sexologist who spent years studying arousal patterns and pleasure preferences. And she found that not everyone experiences desire in the same way. And in fact, our turn-ons can be as unique. In fact, our turn-ons can be as unique as our fingerprints, which of course game changer, because if you don't know what turns you on or why certain things do and don't work for you, it can really feel like you're missing something. But the reality is that maybe you just haven't fully explored your blueprint. And I'm going to break them down and then you're going to kind of see why the smelling the flower things kind of fits into mine and maybe not Nicole's. So the first one, I'm going to, do a little walk you through it. So I want you to imagine that you're walking down this dimly lit room. So very little lighting, there's candles flickering, and the scent of vanilla and sandalwood are in the air. And then your partner's fingertips just graze your skin very slowly, deliberate, just kind of teasing. And if that makes your body hum with this sense of anticipation, you might be a sensual type, someone whose pleasure is deeply tied to ambiance, touch, taste. And so it's this whole immersive sensory experience. So that is the sensual type. But maybe it's that almost touch that does it for you. So the space between your body and your partners and that electric tension that you feel, that you're waiting of that not yet. So you thrive on this longing and anticipation and that tease. The idea of what could happen is actually what turns you on rather than what's happening right now. And that's called the energetic type. And now third one, I'm keeping track. The third one, this is a little bit more simple. So you see something sexy, your body responds. There's no buildup, there's no intricate choreography. You crave nudity, penetration, orgasms, this direct and raw experience of sex. And if that sounds familiar, you might be what is called the sexual type. But for others, it's the forbidden that excites them. So, this idea of pushing boundaries, of exploring taboos, of playing with power and sensation. And maybe it's kind of like the S&M, the submission and dominance, or feeling silk ties around your wrist. That edge, if that edge excites you and kind of like pushing it, then that means that you could be a kinky type. And finally, the last one. Well, there's some of us who are turned on by all of it. We call these the shapeshifters. And the shapeshifters are those who can step into any of these worlds and they find pleasure in every shade of desire. So that means that you're usually a lover of variety, complexity, and depth. And what I think, again, we'll go back into these, but what I think is really interesting about this framework is that it gives us a really interesting way to think about desire. So, not something that is random or mysterious, and it doesn't leave us with that I don't know what I want, which is what we often hear from our clients, but it's something that's a bit more tangible. We can understand it, we can explore it, we can even expand on this. So, just the fact that I was able to kind of paint these 5 different scenarios, and chances are that you felt something. One of these points, maybe more than one, maybe you're a shapeshifter, but it helps us to communicate what we want. So, kind of having these, they're not guidelines, blueprints, right? Like it makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of understand so we can know what we want and so that we can communicate what we want. Nicole and I took the blueprint quiz online, which we can put in the show notes. And my blueprint is, and what came back, and I wasn't really all that surprised by it because I know myself pretty well by now. But what came up was the sensual type. I'm very much smell the flowers, right? I will literally go for a walk and smell the flowers. And that it feels really good for me, like tuning into my senses, the lighting, the smell, the chocolate eclair that I'm picturing and imagining and might go get right after we are done recording this
Please
episode.
do.
Yeah, zero guilt also. That feels very yummy in all parts and all pieces of me. And if we're talking about the what was it, the one's physiological arousal and desire, I think that all of these things kind of function for me on both of those levels. Nicole, what did you get?
I was really mad at my results. And I took this quiz last night and I like sat myself down. Oddly enough, after lighting candles and putting on my incense and getting my slippers on. So I like sensory stuff. And so I'm taking this, right? Really excited to see what I get. I have one that I kind of want for some reason in my mind, and I landed on sexual.
Okay.
And I feel some sort of way because I like to think, or at least how I experience sex is very connective. And for me, like when you read like my quiz results, what it said, and I think maybe this is what turned me off, but
Okay.
it said it's like sex is like oxygen to you. It helps you to relax, to feel alive and feel loved. I agree with the feeling alive and loved part.
Mhm.
It's not like oxygen to me. But the other part, I just thought the description was really interesting. Okay, it said essentially my goal is orgasm. And I'm thinking about it, and to be honest, a lot of my sexual experiences were not orgasm focused at all for me, which goes into a whole other conversation about being a female and not getting to experience pleasure. But yeah, I felt some sort of way. And as I read down, these quiz results are really cool. So if anybody takes them, they give you your superpowers of your blueprint, they give you your shadow aspects. So essentially,
Oh
the
yeah.
the part that will show up that is like the darker side of this, right? And one of them that did resonate was shame is typically a shadow of the sexual erotic blueprint holder. So feeling kind of like shameful that they do really enjoy sex and they do enjoy nudity and they do enjoy that whole experience. So maybe there's an element of shame.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what you were speaking to of, but I
Yeah.
didn't want, to get this result.
Uh,
So I think that that's what's speaking to your shadow. And I'm really glad you brought that up because, of course, I painted, my sensual blueprint as this like great and amazing thing. The shadow to that is that anytime any of these little sensory experiences are off, or the lighting is off, or it doesn't go the way that I had intended it to go in my head, when I'm just like, breaks, right?
it's
Like it goes
done.
done. Like I'm
Yeah.
very much in the headspace where this did not look the way that I imagined it. This does not feel exactly how I intended it to. Therefore, this is not what I want to be doing. It's really hard to tolerate when the feel of things don't match up with the reality and the vision of it. Like when there's a mismatch there, it's really, really hard. So yeah, it isn't like one is better than the other.
Right.
There isn't like this is what you should aim to be when you're taking a little quiz and circle mostly A's so that you can be this fun, energetic type. No, because there is
Yeah.
a shadow side to
Yeah.
this as well. You're always going to some extent, be struggling with something. There isn't good, bad, desire. There is a thing that you'll have to work through, that you will have to understand about yourself. And all of this is just information so that you're able to communicate better, understand yourself better, and then, of course, communicate that with whomever you're choosing to share this information with.
Absolutely. And that conversation too. So your reaction to your results after you take it, tune into that, because if you did land somewhere like I did of having this really visceral kind of like resistant reaction to the results, is it's probably indicating there's maybe a little bit more work and messaging to unpack and modify. And that's all I'll say on that, is maybe I have some more work to do.
Yes, and also as I was reading, about these, there's something kind of basic about the sexual type that it's like, yep, you are like wham bam, thank you, ma'am, right?
Second, that's not what
They
it is.
No, they didn't really. I don't think it does a great job of highlighting it either, right? And so I understand why it may have been a little bit resistant, and it doesn't have the good storyline or the plot that the sensual has.
Thank you.
The energetic or the shapeshifter, right? Like those feel like storylines, and we can kind of get into that. The sexual one,
It's
I
a
feel like
teenage boy. It's a teenage boy going through puberty who found porn for the first time ever. Like,
that's a
that's
good
my
story.
story.
That is a story, and
I don't
that
want it.
no, it's still a good story. It's still a good story, Fred.
But to Maria's point, the conversation today truly is understanding ourselves better to therefore share this with our partner and understand them better and they us, right? So whether that be kind of breaking down, how do I experience desire in me spontaneously, responsively, contextually, maybe a mix of all three, depending on environment, time, age, it changes how we experience desire. But with this erotic blueprint as well, right? Kind of getting in touch so we can build more of the sex that we want, right? And so that our partner has a clear understanding of what it is that we need when we're going there together. It's a
Yeah.
tool.
And funny enough, because I had taken this quiz before and I retook it yesterday. And so I think I was thinking, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get a completely different
Wait, did
blueprint.
you?
I did not. I got the same one. Yes. So I can't vouch for the fact that, there's consistency and consistency throughout all this, but there does seem to be a trending tendency towards the things that, bring up that arousal or that desire. And so again, it's all in information. It isn't like this is it and this is who you are and now you are the shapeshifter or the sexual you know, teenage boy. That's not it at all. These are such conversation starters. And so If that doesn't resonate with you, we've also got one more tool for you, which I think is also kind of fun. And it's a bit of a exercise in terms of writing down your ideal sexual experience. And it's not like the perfect, like we're not going to go for the perfect here. That's not, what this exercise is about, but it is about imagining, again, this is all visualization, this ideal sexual experience. We want to be very specific, step by step. And here's the kicker: we don't want to just write what happened. So we don't want to just talk about the sequence of events and how it all comes down. We want to talk about why you're choosing these elements. So the why is actually the most important part here. So what's the setting? Why is it that setting? What's the smells? Why are those smells important to you? Maybe there is no smell. Maybe that's not a thing that you even care about. Textures, sensations, right? More than anything, we are looking at the why. So paint it out, write down step by step this ideal sexual experience, and then get curious about the why. And again, not about scripting the sex, but it's all about getting to know your own erotic mind and seeing where it goes and what kind of tendencies you have naturally, like what's naturally occurring for you.
I love that so much. And if you have a positive or ideal sexual experience you can even refer back to, that's great too, right? So instead of idealizing one that hasn't happened, you can always draw on aspects of past scenarios that might have felt nice to then kind of puzzle piece that together.
Yeah.
Um, but
And
in
you can
yeah,
also go back to what you were talking about regarding the eclair, right? So maybe it doesn't
yeah.
start in the bedroom. Maybe it starts on your couch and you're reading. This is going to be so me. You're reading a book and, the lighting and all of the things. And then that turns into something else, right? There's so many ways in which you can be creative about this while honoring yourself. And if the bedroom feels a little too scary and we don't want to start there, start elsewhere. Start with, where do you feel pleasure outside of that?
Absolutely. And we highly encourage, if it feels safe and feels good, to invite your partner in. This is just one step further to a little debrief after you guys have sex. Maybe not right away. Let it sink into it, savor it, stay in bed. You don't have to go into debrief and process mode right then, but maybe it's worth like the next day. Hey, like, what was it about that did you like? Right? What felt good for you? What felt different? What felt surprising? Were you curious about anything? Right? Like, that might be something just kind of getting into a habit of.
And I think it also prolongs kind of that sexy energy,
Yeah.
talking about it. And
Yeah.
I really liked when that happened, or when you did that, or when I did that. It's almost like the sex continues. We've had this actual
Yep.
encounter, but the sex continues. And that's kind of the energy that we take into the next connection or the next sexual encounter. So beyond the, okay, let's sit down and therapize our sex, not not necessarily.
Oh,
It does help to build more of that momentum. It is more of
yeah.
gas to share the things that your partner did well or that you enjoyed.
Absolutely. Love this. I'm feeling all sorts of ways.
I know.
Um,
Not gonna care for me. Where are you going after this? Because we're all feeling things after this episode.
I'm gonna go outside. I'm gonna go breathe. I need some food. So I'm with you. I'm all about the senses right now.
Yes, we're going to find pleasure in the senses at this moment. And that's today's episode. But next episode, we're going to be talking about something really fun. I mean, actually, it's like the least fun thing to talk about when you're in it, because this is what falls into the category of what's called the sex cycle. Big word for essentially saying, when I approach, they retreat, a bit of that push and pull dynamic. And then when they pull away, then I feel rejected. So then I don't initiate. And then when I don't initiate, you can see
Yeah.
where this is going. And it is a very common problem that we often talk about with couples. So if you want to know there's no answers. There's never any answer. But if you want, to more and understand why that happens and what you can do, then join us for the next episode.